Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to look at a question of whether or not we want the people who are currently in control of our entertainment to start writing good stories and thus give us good entertainment, or do we need to have everyone who is in those systems of entertainment wiped away so that we can start clean? And I know that almost everyone who's listening to my voice probably already has their own answer to that question. But at the same time, I think it's an important question and an important distinction to go over and basically flush out so that you or I can understand and explain to others why exactly we think this way. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that the link is in the description for my current superhero graphic novel campaign. It is called The Valiant Heroes. It is an 82-page graphic novel of good old superhero entertainment, excitement, and fun. And also there is a link for the early bird sign-up page for my next graphic novel, which is a fantasy epic, CROM the Destroyer. And also, I put together 2 different trailers for that. The second one I just published last night. So I'll put those links in the description for those 2 trailers as well. So click on those trailers and see if CROM the Destroyer actually appeals to you, because it gives you a good sense of what the story is and a lot of the art as well. So, as I said, all of those links are in the description. But back to my topic. And the reason why I'm talking about this right now is because, and I know I probably have this entire thing wrong, because I don't really care about internet drama. I don't care about YouTube drama. But apparently Zach over at Comics Matter is having some kind of tiff with, I think it's Doomcock. Basically, Zach's mindset is, no, we just have to get these people to actually write good stories, and we can go back to liking this kind of entertainment. Whereas the Doomcock mindset is, no, we can't go back to this. We have to completely wipe these people off the board and then go back to good storytelling. And again, I'm not really heavily invested into this, and I probably have that slightly wrong, if not completely wrong in some way. But at the very least, let's look at those 2 mindsets as if they weren't attached to these 2 people and see which one actually has the more merit. And I'll give you my bias and my opinion on this right at the beginning, and then obviously, as I usually do, give you the reasoning behind why I have that opinion. While I was at the beginning of this channel, when I created it almost 5 years ago, of the opinion that, yeah, we simply have to get these people to write good stories, I've slowly moved more and more towards the idea that, no, I'm sorry, this industry has to be completely renewed so that if we want to get anything good from it at all, or go back to it at all, we need to have a complete reset back to the last known good. Now, most of my information comes from the comic industry, which I use because it is a very, very good microcosm that we have a lot of information on that represents all of the other entertainment industries combined, if you ask me. And that being said, I would say what I'm about to say, even though I'm using comic examples, can be applied to anything: television, movies, gaming, anything. So in order to get to the answer to this question and why I think this way, I'm going to go down a very large rabbit hole, which I usually do. So if you listen to me, that's no surprise. But I'll start with, as I said, the reason why I came to this realization. One of the major turning points in how I came to think more and more in this way. And it is something that happened really recently. And it's the fact that Ann Nocenti is going to write new comics for Marvel. And they are new X-Men comics. Well, at the very least, they're new stories, but she's using old stories to tell them. That is to say, she's writing a Storm story from the X-Men, but she's writing her in her Mohawk phase, which was back in the 1980s. So the time frame of these stories is the 1980s. And the thing is that I love the 1980s Chris Claremont X-Men, and I love the Ann Nocenti 1980s stories about Daredevil. So I thought to myself, I'm probably not going to buy it, but I might give it an eye to see what it's like. And then I learned what the story was actually about. What Ann Nocenti is writing is a basically love story between Storm and I think it's Yoko, which is one of the old X-Men characters. I don't know if she's even in the new X-Men books or not. Anyways, these are 2 women and she's going to put in a love story about them, and that's what this new book is going to be about. And as soon as I heard that, I went, nope. Not buying it, not a chance in hell. It just sounds like so much of this woke garbage that we have right now, And on top of that, it's seeking to subvert the actual history of these characters, which I really love. So I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to look at those old stories as I have them and leave it that way. And as I was thinking this in my mind, then, as if on cue, the source that I got this information from went right into why this is actually a good thing and why you should actually buy it, even though you might not think this is your kind of story anymore. And that explanation was Ann Nesenti saying, well, you see, this is what Chris Claremont wanted to do with these characters originally. He just couldn't do it. And that's when something really, really dawned on me. And it was the fact that I used to think to myself, I really like Chris Claremont stories. And I really like Ann Nesenti stories. That's what I thought to myself. Up until about a couple of months ago, when I came across this information. But I realized to myself, no, it's much more nuanced than that. It's that I like Chris Claremont stories, and I like Ann Nesenti stories as they were presented to me by Marvel Comics in the 1980s. And those caveats make all the difference. Why? Because here's the thing. I realize, in making comics myself, I really, really realize this, that it is a collaborative effort to say the least. So, when you have a collaboration of more than one artist, you have a system of checks and balances. And that's the thing. Marvel in the 1980s had a series of checks and balances so that someone like Chris Claremont or Ann Nesenti or any other artist or any other person who worked there couldn't just go off and do their own thing, couldn't get their way entirely. Why? Because they had to collaborate with these other artists, and the editors actually did their jobs and made sure everyone did their jobs, and so there was a check on everybody's reach, and so you could not just do what you wanted to do. And this is how good storytelling, and really good art of any kind, is actually made. And I'll go into that very deeply in just a minute, but the point is that, sure, you can have someone, an individual, who does everything and thus produces a good piece of art, but those people are savants. Those people are 1 in a trillion. You're not going to find those people very often in history. And quite honestly, especially for story, there was no way you could do that up until about 20 years ago, maybe a little more, with the advent of the internet and the ability of people to actually simply write a story and just throw it up there on the internet, which a lot of people do. They self-publish their own stories, their own novels. They don't go through any editor. They just edit the stories themselves, etc., etc. It's a one-man show. But prior to that point, no, there was no chance. You were writing a story and getting it out into the world without it going through more than just your hands. And there's a reason, as I said, why there is a system in place for it to go through multiple people's hands, and a reason why art is made better by doing so, and it all goes back to that logical and rational definition of what art is. Because here's the thing, these quote-unquote progressive people, not everything they say is wrong. Quite the opposite. The reason why they've gained such traction is because they're good liars. And a good liar takes a bit of truth and mixes it with a falsehood in order to sell it to people. And their ideological falsehood that they use is that everything is dependent upon power. Everything is a power dynamic, and that expresses itself by them saying everything is systematically this or systematically that. You have systematic oppression of one kind or another, which is basically saying the people with power in these institutions are the bad people, and the people without power in these institutions are the good people. But the truth that is connected to that lie, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that, yeah, there is a systematic connection between almost everything in our society. Now, taking it to the power extreme, and the dynamic of oppressor and oppressed, no, to me, that's a lie. Not to say that there aren't such people and such institutions, but it's dependent upon the individuals and their actions. You can't judge them according to groups. That's where the lie comes in. It's trying to group people together so you can judge them via their group. But anyways, the point is, yes, they're correct in that there is a tie-in with all of these systems. But again, the tie-in of this system, which they see, is power. But the tie-in for the system, which has been built for millennia now, and which I'm always talking about, isn't power, It's rationality. Power is a part of it, but it's not the central part. The central part is reason. Why? Because we've learned over the centuries, over the millennia, that if you wish to have the power to actually produce effects from a cause, you need to work in accord with reality. How do you work in accord with reality? Well, you do so through reason. Because reason is based upon taking the way that we view the world, see the world, understand the world, and making our understanding in conjunction with what is real, which then allows us to understand how cause and effect works, and then allows us to use that understanding to direct, that is to say, to have the power to direct cause and effect in the way that we want effects to go. And this rational understanding how things work through cause and effect is the basis for and ties together all of the institutions in our society, whether they be how our politics are supposed to work, how our money system is supposed to work, how our education systems are supposed to work, how our medical systems are supposed to work, how our systems of entertainment and storytelling are supposed to work. They're all tied together in an institutionalized way based upon reason. Now, first of all, I say supposed to work because we're humans, we're fallible, we tend to mess things up all the time. We're not the most rational people in the world. That is to say, we have a broken human nature where our reason, which is supposed to be in control, is usually dominated by our passions because we are in, especially today, a state where our passions are allowed to run rampant, etc., etc. That's number one. Number two, I'll come back to this institutionalized part of this entire thing in a few minutes. But let's move on to how this idea of rationality holds up storytelling, and eventually, of course, why this would answer the question of why the current systems of storytelling will not be able to hold, even if they start to give us some good stories. Well, first off, let's look at art itself. What is the rational definition of art that we've had since the 4th century BC? Well, expressed by Aristotle, it's the fact that art is the ability to take an idea from your mind and translate it into external matter. And yes, I'm going with the 4th century BC definition of art. Why? Because that's the definition of art that we've used for the last couple of millennia. I'm sorry if it hasn't been used in the last 80 to 100 years, but it doesn't trump the 2 millennia before that, nor the fact that that 2 millennia of movement is still moving us in that direction. It is still how we see as a culture art, whether we know it or not. And it's not just a cultural thing. It's because it's based on reality. It has something to do with reality itself and the reality of human nature and how we look at something and say, that's beautiful. But art is defined in this way, if I can explain it correctly, because an idea needs to work in accord with reality in order to be brought into external matter. Because people like shipwrights and architects, they're seen as artists as well. They are artists. And if a shipwright wants to build a ship that is going to float, then he has to work with reality and the rules of reality to do so. If an architect wants to build a high-rise that isn't going to fall down, again, he needs to work in accord with reality. If that building is going to stand, if that boat is going to float, they need to take their idea and apply the cause and effect understanding of reality through rationality to their idea in order to translate it properly into reality. If they translate it improperly, it's not going to be the actual thing that they think they're building. If you build a boat that's not going to float, it's not really a boat. It's just an abstract piece of art. And I use the word art there with heavy quotation marks. I would say it's more an example of what not to do. But the same thing works for the artist of the shipwright and the architect, and for the storyteller as well. It doesn't have the same dramatic effect as a ship sinking or a building falling down on your head, but the same thing applies. If you take your story and you don't apply the rules of reality to it when you try to translate it from your own mind into external reality, it's not going to float. It's not going to stand up. And we can see that by people saying, no, I don't want to read this story. No, this isn't a good story. And that's why we have Aristotle, again, in the 4th century BC, working off of stories that were 800 years older than him, saying that, yeah, story is a representation of reality. Because that's how it conveys its meaning. The author says, I understand how I, as a human being, and you as a human being, and everyone else as human beings, understand things, and so how naturally people think, and I'm going to have to work within those confines, those limitations, in order for me to take my thoughts and impart to you in a way that you can understand what exactly I'm trying to say. And this runs right into the next definition of story that Aristotle gives us, which is that story is a rhetorical argument. Why? Rhetorical arguments, if used correctly, are in accord with reason. And reason itself, if you go back into it, it is most definitely a system of understanding how language works and putting our language in accord with reality so that it expresses what is real. This is what I'm always going on about. The steps to get to logic are simple apprehension, judgment, reason, logic. Those are all individual steps that need to be there successively in order for you to get to a logical understanding of things. Simple apprehension itself, in its most basic form, is the ability to define what a thing is in reality. And when you move on to judgment, it is to take those terms which you already defined and put one next to another and say, this is a part of that. And when I say is, I mean in accord with reality, this is that in some way. So a statement like, man is fallible. Yeah, you're defining the same thing there twice, connecting it with is to say this and that in reality share this commonality. So it's all about language, and thus language for a story is supposed to work in this rational way in order to impart real ideas and real understanding from one individual to another, etc., etc. So why am I going so far into the weeds here? Well, it's because I want to show, number one, that yes, the way we tell stories is according to a rational system. And two, the cultural institutions that have developed around how we tell stories and how we convey stories to the public is not only based upon this, but works best when it is based upon this. And it works best because we understand that individuals, we're not oracles of truth. None of us are going to get this exact thing correct ever. Not just not on our first time, but ever. And so if we understand that, then we understand that if we want to have a correct representation of reality, whether it's a story or a ship or a building or whatever, then the more hands it can pass through of people who are in an artistic way trained to understand and work with what we're dealing with in order to bring it into external reality, the more people it goes through in that kind of a system, the better it becomes. Or at the very least, the better it should become. Not to say that we should have a board of trustees slapping together a story, or this committee-made storytelling that we have within movies and television right now. No, that doesn't work. Why? Because these people are not artists. Or at the very least, if they are artists, i.e. people who are trained in understanding the specific form of art that they're dealing with in this way, then they're not appealing to the fundamental principles of rational understanding and a representation of reality that they should be in order to create a story. Because the whole idea of a committee is a consensus. No, reality doesn't work according to consensus. Reality works in accord with what is the strongest principle. And so if one person has a stronger understanding of the principle than all the rest, then yeah, he's in control. It's not a committee. So we had developed a system whereby you have copy editors and story editors and editors-in-chiefs, etc., and you have supposedly the other artistic people that you're supposed to work with, also providing some checks and balances to what exactly you're trying to do artistically. Why? Because if you're all pulling together and you all understand that this should be a good representation of reality, then the more hands it goes through of these professional people, the more and more Each one of them is going to look at everybody else's work and say, you see, you have a blind spot here. You don't quite understand this part. You see, you're making a mistake here. That's what editors are supposed to be for. They're supposed to tell you what's real and what's not. They're supposed to say, listen, I know you think you're being colorful in your language, but language doesn't work that way here, here, and here. Rewrite it. And again, that goes right back to defining things. That goes right back to simple apprehension, and then the judgment of being able to place this next to that. It's all about language. It's all about a rational understanding how language works. That's how the systems of not only definitions, but grammar and everything else have developed over the last couple of millennia. And that's what story editors are for. Story editors will look at things and say, no, you see, a human being would not say this thing naturally, therefore you have to give a reason for it. Either rewrite it so it's not there, or give some reason for it in some other part of the story prior to this. Or to say, you see, you've already written this continuity here, and that doesn't follow cause and effect from that continuity. Therefore, rewrite this part. Or again, rewrite your cause so that it produces this effect. The entire thing goes back to rational understanding of not only language, but how reality and human existence actually works. That's what an editor really does. And so, if you have a system that works according to storytelling, like we did with comics back in the 1980s, then you had editors actually editing people saying, no, rewrite this. No, you can't do that, Chris. No, you have to write a story that is this way or that. I've listened to interviews where you had Jim Shooter, and he's talking about how he would tell Chris Claremont, no, that's a bad story. He wanted to, Chris Claremont, write the Dark Phoenix saga, wherein she destroyed an entire planet full of people, and then just got away with it scot-free. And what did Jim Shooter do? Well, out of his own mouth, he said, I told him, no, that's a bad story. You can't do it that way. Why? Because he was the editor-in-chief. And by the way, to tie it into what I'm always going on about, this is why these kinds of well-oiled storytelling industries actually produced heroic stories. Why? Because heroism is the penultimate expression of living in accord with reality. The whole thing that I'm always going on about, which again is more than 3 millennia old, is that a hero is a paragon of virtue, and those virtues are based upon right reason. That is to say, your reason in accord with reality, which allows you the first controlling virtue, which is prudence, which is the ability to make decisions according to right reason, etc., etc. But the point is, again, this is part of my realization. Why I say to myself now, no, I don't like Chris Claremont stories. I don't like Ann Nesenti stories. I like Ann Nesenti and Chris Claremont stories as they were expressed through the system of Marvel Comics in the 1980s. Why? Because there were checks and balances according to a healthy system, according to how storytelling was supposed to work, in order to ensure that someone like Jim Shooter told Chris Claremont, no, you can't write a story like that. Too bad. Rewrite it. Don't put that in. I'm sorry, you're not going to tell that story. That's why those stories were good, and that's why I like those stories under those caveats. And that's just a big old long way of me following cause and effect to try to explain that yes, it is a system in place, and there needs to be a system which runs in accord with all of the rest of the systems within our society according to that rational principle, that ideal of in accord with reality. That system needs to work that way in order for good stories to be produced. And the reason why that leads to the understanding that we need to wipe away what is actually there within these quote-unquote systems of storytelling that we have right now is expressed by 2 very short quotes, which I'll give you, one new and one old. I just by chance happened to throw this up on my channel as a short because I'm doing shorts now to try to take all of these quotes that I use over and over again and put them up in an accessible way for everyone to see them in a very short manner. But it is a short from that Zoom meeting, which was the Writers Guild of America, where they had comic book writers and show writers and show producers talking about how to, quote unquote, queer legacy characters, and had one of the writers saying, well, you see, first of all, it's all about power. You don't have power as a writer. So what you need to do is bide your time, bite your tongue, and make sure that you climb the ladder in order to have more power. Why? Because, as he says, quote, you need to disrupt this broken model. He's saying this model that works within the writing rooms and how you write, it's systemically broken. And how does he say it's systemically broken? Well, you see, the writers, the people who have little power within the room, are the representation of marginalized groups, again, going back to the power dynamic of oppressor and oppressed. And how, pray tell, does he say to disrupt this model that actually exists, which is the remnant of the rational systematic model that has been in place for millennia? What does he say to do? Well, he says, again, bide your time and build your power so that eventually you get to be in control of the system. Which, once again, goes back to, you see, the people in power, they need to be displaced by us, the people without power. We need to change the power dynamic. It always goes back to power, and we just want to turn the entire system on its head. That's the new example, because that was about 6 months ago that Zoom meeting happened. I'll give you an old example from comics anyways. I covered an interview a year ago or more from Bobby Chase, where she was talking about how she originally got into Marvel because she became one of Marvel's editors-in-chiefs. And these are words from her own mouth, so I'll take them as being true, or at the very least, the way that she thinks. And she said when she was hired, which was in the late 1980s, she was told that, listen, you need to take your Northeastern politics and check them at the door if you want to work at Marvel, because the majority of our readers don't think that way. And what she said she did was she nodded her head, yes, yes, and then went about subverting everything so that it was no longer that way. And she says she did this because this is what she learned from her parents. Her parents were heavy, quote-unquote, progressive people who would move every once in a while, and when they would get to their new town, they would join the Republican Party. Yes, the Republican Party, not telling anyone around them that they were progressive people. Why? Because they were doing it to subvert the electoral process within the Republican Party, within the area that they lived in. This is how her parents operated. She took that as to be the norm of how you do things, and so she was doing the exact same thing when she got into Marvel Comics. She was subverting the system so that she could get her way, not the way that they wanted her or the editors to actually act, because again, she didn't think that was right. And lo and behold, what do we get? We get her eventually producing these quote-unquote progressive stories, which then led into her becoming one of the editors-in-chief for Marvel Comics, which again is climbing the ladder just the same as that guy had talked about within the last 6 months. This is a story from 6 months ago. This is a story from 40 years ago. They're both talking about the exact same thing. They're talking about subverting the system that actually produces good stories. They believe in the old expressed idea of the long march through the institutions, that they need to get into, worm their way into these systems that exist and subvert them so that they work in accord with what? Not reality, but their political ideology. That's what the long march through the institutions actually is. And we know that it's an institution not of reality, but of political ideology, because it's all based upon power. That quote that I gave you from that guy 6 months ago, it starts with power. He says, here's my advice. You don't have a lot of power, but, and then he goes on to explain how you gain power. Again, the systems that we're talking about, they're not supposed to be a system of power production or power exchange. They're supposed to be entertainment systems. Power is used to produce the entertainment, but power is a means to an ends. It's not the ends in itself. These people see power as the ends in itself. And so, no, these people are not going to produce good stories. Or if they do, they're producing good stories in order to bide their time, in order to destroy the entire system that produces good stories. And again, this is not me making something up. This is me quoting that fella. If you want to go watch that short, go over to the shorts. I only got a couple of them up right now. And listen to him say this exact thing. And so, to use that ship analogy once again, why in the world would you bring onto your crew someone who's deliberately trying to sabotage the boat so that it sinks? And sure, there is one alternative. That alternative is to have someone like a Jim Shooter come in to be a heavy-handed editor-in-chief and make sure everybody does their job according to how they're supposed to do their job in order to fulfill their place within this system that works. But if you were to have such a person, which, by the way, I think Jim Shooter actually did this when he was at Marvel Comics and made it spectacular by doing so. But if you have someone like that, what are you going to get? Well, you're going to get these people who you think can write good stories, but aren't there really to write good stories. You're going to have them quit. You're going to have them leave. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. It's either wipe the board entirely clean and start anew, or bring someone in there which is going to drive out everybody, which basically wipes the slate clean so that you can start anew. And the fact that this has to be done, I think, is shown in what these quote-unquote progressive people fear. Because they tell you right up front, if you're listening to what they're trying to say, what they fear. They're always, as I said, always going on about systematic this and systematic that. Why? Because it's all about the system. It's all about their control of the system. They don't want anyone in control of the system except for them. That's what they fear. Upmost and foremost, they fear losing control of the systems that they have taken so long to gain control of. Because we've seen a couple of examples of this already with something like Twitter. If you come in to an institution or a company and say, listen, we're going to start doing things according to merit once again. We're going to go back to the old way of doing things, which is to say, we're going back to the old system. What are the employees, these people who have wormed their way in and want to destroy their company? If they know they're going to be driven out and their whole purpose there is to sabotage, to disrupt the system, what are they going to do if they know they're gone? Well, they're going to try to burn it down. Quite simply, they're going to try to destroy as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And my answer to someone like Richard is to say, listen, you were a soldier. Why in the world would you take someone onto your team who's a saboteur? Even if they're contrite and playing by the rules right now, why in the world would you take someone into your unit who has expressed on multiple occasions that if they get the chance, they want to shoot you in the back? So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And also, don't forget, I'll link in the description and here at the end those 2 trailers for my upcoming graphic novel, CROM the Destroyer. They're very short. So click on one of those and see if my graphic novel that's coming up is for you. You might want to sign up so you can get your free exclusive pinup poster if you order from the campaign. And also in the description is the link for my superhero graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.